Before we dive into today's episode, I want to share something really exciting. The Summer Solstice Summit is back. This is the second annual gathering where tarot readers, witches, therapists, and creative practitioners come together for a weekend of learning, reflection, and magic. This year's summit takes place June 26th through the 28th, and we have an incredible lineup. Presenters are going to be exploring topics like advanced tarot systems, ancestry and death work, psychology and creative practice, expanded divination methods, and so much more. It's a 3-day virtual event, which means you can join us from anywhere in the world because it's happening over Zoom. And if you can't attend live, every session is recorded so you can watch at your own pace. So if you love the intersection of tarot, psychology, ritual, and creativity, this weekend will be so fulfilling and inspiring for you. The feedback from last year's summit was so overwhelmingly positive. Folks were buzzing for months as they implemented everything that they learned and said that the energy was so magical and supportive and warm. You can learn more and grab your ticket at thetarotdiagnosis.com/summer solstice or via the link in the show notes. I hope to see you all there. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. For the last several months, I've been thinking about pillars in the tarot, what they could mean for us individually and collectively on a deeper psychological level. And then I was thinking about one of my favorite quotes that I use all the time in therapy, which is often attributed to Viktor Frankl, that says, quote, "Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our ability to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom," end quote. And I think about that space that exists between the pillars in tarot, specifically the High Priestess, Justice, the Hierophant, and yes, even the moon, which I will talk about later, and how this quote might apply to those archetypes. And because I am always asking questions, I wondered, what if the pillars in tarot are not just symbols of duality like we sometimes like to think of them as? What if they are symbolic representations of psychological containment and that space between stimulus and response? What if they're thresholds that create a space in which the psyche can encounter the themes of the archetype itself, like uncertainty, morality, intuition, projection, fear, and meaning making? What if tarot places us between these symbolic structures because that's where human consciousness and growth develops, in those types of liminal spaces? And the more I sat with the cards, the more I was thinking about the pillars as being curious regarding what happens with the tension and the space that exists between them. Historically, pillars have symbolized, obviously, stability, but also connection between worlds. And architecturally, they quite literally hold structures upright. So they're very important. And spiritually, they often mark sacred thresholds where transformation becomes possible. I mean, think about any sort of important building that usually has some sort of ornate column or pillar, typically outside, representing that once you step beyond them, you're going to have a very specific type of experience. We could be thinking of these tarot pillars in the same way. Ancient cultures always used columns and pillars and temples and initiation spaces and any sort of sacred architecture because they were communicating that this was a place of significance. So yeah, why wouldn't that then translate to tarot? What fascinates me is that the cards containing pillars are also deeply connected to psychological and emotional tension. the tension between what we feel and what we think, between what we know implicitly and what we can actually consciously articulate, between inherited belief systems and our own personal convictions. And then, because of the moon, between ambiguity and our desperate, very human desire for certainty. The High Priestess feels especially important in this discussion, and it's really the card that I've been sitting with the most when I've just been thinking about these pillars. And something that I'm always drawn to is that obviously connected between these two pillars is this pomegranate tapestry. But there's these few slivers of water visible because the pomegranate curtain tapestry, whatever you want to call it, isn't fully covering what is beyond the High Priestess. And so this pomegranate tapestry behind her, hanging between these two pillars, is only partially obscuring what, at least to me, appears to be a very vast body of water, suggesting that our unconscious material is neither fully accessible nor is it entirely hidden. And I think this partial obscurity is significant because it reflects the reality of self-awareness. The unconscious is not completely sealed off or inaccessible. And it's also not ever completely, entirely, fully knowable because human beings experience themselves through fragments, through intuition, through physical and emotional sensations, through dreams, projections, and all kinds of incomplete stories and narratives and thoughts and perceptions. Something else that I like to point out about this card is how light and airy the tapestry is, which I think just further amplifies this symbolism of self-awareness, because unlike a thick, more heavy, rigid tapestry like we see in Justice, which we're going to talk about next, the fabric behind the High Priestess is permeable. It's capable of movement. There's fluctuation. There's a level of like softness and lightness to this fabric that we don't see in Justice, for example. And so symbolically, that feels pretty important because I think it mirrors openness and, again, that kind of like emotional permeability or a level of curiosity, like, hey, let's peek behind the curtain. There is something here. You're welcome to look. There isn't this kind of obscurity where you have no permission to look. Clearly, the High Priestess wants us to see that there is something beyond her. Another component here that I think gets overlooked a lot is the fact that the High Priestess can represent kind of pre-verbal knowing. So this is, again, like more somatic feeling versus cognitively being able to organize and articulate what's happening. And so when we look at this through a more contemporary trauma-informed lens or even somatic lens, research is increasingly recognizing that the body registers emotions and fear and intuition, all of that, prior to our ability to consciously articulate or create a cohesive narrative discussion on what we are experiencing. And I think that shows us that we have this physiological tension, this unease, or this kind of instinctive reaction to what happens to us or what could be happening to us long before we have the ability to kind of intellectually explain something. And so basically everything that I'm saying, if you're someone who studies Jungian psychology, you know, the High Priestess is very much representative of both, I think, sensing and intuiting functions. All right, so let's move over to Justice now, because with Justice, we see a markedly different mode of psychological functioning. So when we were talking about the High Priestess, she symbolizes this like intuition, sensing, this kind of embodied implicit knowing. And Justice then symbolizes the organization of all of that emotional, sensing, intuitive experience and is able to formulate it into a more cohesive, cognitive, articulate structure that we can verbalize. I think there's a lot of practicality with justice too that maybe the High Priestess doesn't really bother herself with, because justice really prioritizes interpretation, likes to categorize, loves a good assessment, and really just wants to end on a solid, clear conclusion. Whereas the High Priestess kind of remains comfortable with not knowing, that ambiguity, kind of just swimming in things that could be, and doesn't really care to organize or have a conclusion. And justice really just wants whatever's happening to be resolved. And I think this distinction reflects a really important psychological tension between our emotional processing and then our intellectual organization of all of that. Because humans possess a really profound desire to take uncertainty and turn it into clarity, especially when we're confronted with anything that feels emotionally destabilizing. So within more therapeutic contexts, individuals are always kind of seeking definitive answers, whether that's, and also I shouldn't even say therapeutic. I mean, if you're listening to this and you're not a therapist, which many of you aren't, and you are someone who reads tarot for people, you see this as well. People want answers. They come to you and they say, tell me about my relationships. Tell me about my identity. How do I heal from my trauma? How do I get over this betrayal? What is my moral compass telling me? So there's this drive and desire to seek clarity and answers. And it's often usually before any sort of emotional integration has fully occurred. So therapists know this very well, where it's like, just fix me, make all this go away. And there hasn't been any sort of work done to integrate the emotional experience. And that's why being more of a trauma-informed tarot reader is really important too, because you could potentially do more harm in these types of situations. So you have to be really careful. Something else that we see in justice is that this level of coherence seeking and organization and cognitive functioning can also be a defense mechanism. So we have to be careful there. So it might be, especially when we pair the High Priestess and justice together, we might have the illusion of certainty in order to regulate our own anxiety, or the sensation that we have that's linked to ambiguity with the High Priestess. Justice symbolizes this kind of movement towards interpreting that in order to create order. But if we're rushing that, there's a lot that we might be bypassing. So we also have to allow ourselves to pause. And we see this kind of play out in the visual differences between justice and the High Priestess, because I want to go back to the tapestry again, because I always, and this is just me, I always pay so much attention to the curtains behind these two cards. It's just where my eyes and my brain go. And so when I'm working with folks and these two cards come up, if they don't point it out, it's eventually something that I will point out and try to facilitate some sort of discussion around to see what it's like for them to experience, these tapestries. Because again, with the High Priestess, there's a lot of movement, there's permeability, and it's actually a small tapestry. I mean, it's a very small piece of fabric, in between these two pillars, where when we move towards justice, it's a massive curtain, a very thick, heavy, drooping piece of fabric that is in between these two pillars, and it's obscuring absolutely everything behind it. We have no idea what is resting beyond this thick, heavy fabric. And I think that level of concealment could suggest a reduced level of tolerance for ambiguity. Basically saying what you see here is what you get. Like, it is what it is. We're not peeking behind this. We are not entertaining anything that's behind this. Kind of what I say, what I see, what I have created out of the sensation of the High Priestess is what goes. It must be truth. And justice has to be really careful, though, because it can become over-intellectualized, overly certain, and stand firm in disguising that as rationality. And this is particularly prevalent among those of us who might have a really high degree of justice sensitivity, where kind of ambiguity in and of itself might feel threatening. And so it leads to sometimes premature conclusions or being very kind of morally rigid and making big kind of ethical proclamations in an effort to restore your own kind of emotional and psychological stability. The Hierophant actually introduces another dimension to all of this by shifting our attention from the psychological and emotional space between stimulus and response in these two pillars of justice and High Priestess towards more of a collective and institutional space between stimulus and response. So the Hierophant's pillars represent the space within organized systems where things can remain as they are or either be open to change. So, think religion, culture, educational systems, political systems, morality and ethical systems, social conventions, all of this becomes really relevant within this card because the Hierophant symbolizes the frameworks through which we learn how to interpret ourselves and the world around us simply by engaging in all of those types of experiences. I mean, anthropologists have been arguing forever, and the research shows that our identity doesn't emerge in isolation. It develops because of all of these systems of language, ritual, authority, social and cultural contexts, that exist around us. And it's these types of inherited frameworks that provide a sense of continuity and belonging and honestly existential orientation, but they can also become restrictive when there's some sort of external authority that's overriding the internal experience. And when we are not granted permission to step into that liminal space between the pillars, often because we're usually encouraged not to challenge what we've grown to know, that's where things can also become a little dangerous. So when we pair the High Priestess with the Hierophant, we see this kind of significant tension emerge because with the High Priestess, she's, asks and values what we sense internally. And so this is more about the self. In fact, whenever I'm doing parts work, internal family systems work, and I'm incorporating tarot, I view the High Priestess as the capital S self. So there's a lot of empowerment and a lot of self-trust that exists within this card. But the Hierophant asks and values what we've been taught to believe. And I think that's why there's so much pushback against this card. I think that there's a significant value that exists in this archetype, but only when it's not rooted in rigidity. Because psychological conflict or cognitive dissonance really can start to arise, especially at the intersection of the High Priestess and the Hierophant. If we're experiencing tension between our sensed, maybe more embodied truth, that big capital S self, and what we have grown to know or inherited in terms of moral and social structures around us, like the Hierophant. But like I was saying earlier, we have to be careful with the Hierophant because it does symbolize the power of collective meaning making. And those types of systems do, whether we are explicitly involved in them or not, shape our perception, our identity, our behaviors, the way we exist in the world, the way the world exists around us. And they can become dangerous when we're not invited to take a seat between them. So when we look at the Hierophant, it's important to be asking, am I allowed to take a seat on this throne in between these pillars? Or am I often pushed aside? Is there space for many voices in between these two pillars? Or does this space only recognize and value a select few? Let's talk about the moon now. And many of you might disagree with me including the moon into this categorical discussion of pillars. And I understand because when we look at the Hierophant, Justice, and High Priestess, these are very specific pillars and columns. And then when we look at the moon, they're more like towers. And so you might be asking, why are you lumping these together? It doesn't make any sense. But even though the card doesn't contain traditional pillars in the same sense of these others, the twin towers framing the distant path do function, at least I think, again, this is all my perception. I think they function symbolically in a similar manner because these towers are framing the animals in the same way that the pillars are framing Justice and the High Priestess and the Hierophant. You know, the moon typically represents illusions and shadows and the kind of like disorienting effect all of that unconscious material can have on us when it starts to move into our awareness. And so I do think the moon plays an important role here because if we are encouraging ourselves to be curious about and step into that liminal space, the thresholds, the quote of between stimulus and response, then we have to be prepared for the kind of fuzziness that might happen that the moon is reflecting back at us. Because when we step into these spaces, our own personal perception can become a little bit harder to rely on because with the moon, things aren't fully illuminated. And anytime we're in new territory, it's really hard to get a grasp on what is fully happening. We haven't spent enough time there to get a full lay of the land. There's a lot of ambiguity. We're not quite sure what to expect. And the moon is also a place where we are often forced into confronting that uncertainty without any sort of reassurance, which is why I feel like it's so resonant with these other three pillar archetypes. And so I've always seen the moon as kind of what's happening behind the pillars, you know, that sort of primal, unconscious space where so much is going on behind the curtain, both individually and collectively. So, all of that to say, next time you pull one of these pillar cards, you might want to ask yourself, what's between stimulus and response for me? What does that space look like? What helps inform and fuel my responses based on the card you're looking at? So before we wrap up, I realized recently that even though this is my favorite quote, between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our ability to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. I realized I've never created a tarot spread based on that quote, which shocked me because that's usually how I come up with my spread ideas, the things that inspire me or that I enjoy engaging with. So I thought it would be fun to kind of figure that out right now, what this spread might look like based on our discussions today. So I'm thinking just 3 cards. I'm thinking stimulus, response, and growth. And you can intuitively pull for this. However, if I was working with somebody, I might have them intentionally pull a card for the response, just based on the type of work we're doing. However, for this, I'm just going to pull all 3 and see what happens. And I'm just going to do kind of like a very quick read. This is not for anything in particular. We're just going to see, it's just a thought exercise. We're going to see what comes up with the cards, have some fun and play around with it. As always, using Tarot Vintage. All right, so card 1 is going to be stimulus. We're just going to see what that means. I have no idea. Whatever the cards say the stimulus is. All right, we have the Magician. Okay, interesting. I think I'm going to pull all 3 cards, and then we'll see what happens. So stimulus, so response, I'll pull for next. And if you, this is a good time for me to give a shameless plug. If you want to see what these cards look like, or you want to get the spread, you should be a part of my email list because I send out emails for episode announcements. And then I always include photos of the cards I pulled. And if I did a spread, the spread will be in that email as well. All right. So, and you can sign up. Just go to my website, thetarotdiagnosis.com. It's super easy. All right. So now we're going to pull for a response. Six of Pentacles. Okay. So we have stimulus, magician. Response is Six of Pentacles. And now we're going to pull for growth. Okay. We had one fall out. We're going with that. Three of Wands. Okay. I love the Three of Wands for growth. That's awesome. All right. So let's look at the magician. So if the magician is representing some sort of stimulus, and then the Six of Pentacles is representing response, my brain is going to, the magician is trying to create and do all on their own with the resources that they have in front of them. So something has happened in their life and there's this feeling or sensation of, I have to figure it out. I can't rely on anybody. I can't do it with help. I've got all the tools. I should just be able to figure it out on my own. I'm capable, which sure, absolutely. But the response is a Six of Pentacles, which might say, well, I'm actually trying to maybe learn what healthy exchange looks like, what it means to graciously receive instead of feeling like I do have to only rely on my own resources. What would it be like to see if other folks want to help support me in some way, whether that's in a physical sense or an emotional sense? And then with growth, we have the Three of Wands, which I feel like speaks for itself, honestly. But I think the growth here is realizing that when you allow yourself to receive and not be in this space of isolation, then your entire world opens up and the possibilities of your own experiences and what life looks like for you suddenly becomes so much larger. And it's less about figuring out how to just survive on your own with what you have and maybe feeling a sense of safety and ease that you haven't felt before because you know that there's options and support just waiting for you. So that's a 3-card spread based on one of my favorite quotes. Let me know if you end up pulling for that and what you get and what comes up for you. And also feel free to reach out and let me know what your thoughts are on the pillars. What did I not mention that you maybe thought of while you were listening that this space could also represent? I know, I got really kind of in the weeds there regarding the space in between the pillars. And I know that the pillars themselves have their own very specific meaning in tarot, but that's not the space we're hanging out in today. So I'm curious, what sort of new or interesting idea popped up for you relating to the pillars? Let me know. Send me a DM, send me an email. And if you enjoyed this episode, it would also be super helpful if you left a review of the podcast on the platform that you listen to. It helps other folks discover the podcast. And it just helps me out. And if you enjoyed this podcast or any of the other podcasts, then you'll probably have a ton of fun at the Summer Solstice Summit that is happening June 26th, 27th, and 28th, because we're going to be talking about all kinds of content and ideas and experiences just like this. A lot of it involving tarot, some divination. There's going to be some bibliomancy stuff, some astrology stuff. It's going to be really exciting. So head over to thetarotdiagnosis.com/summer solstice and grab your weekend pass. And yes, I know it's 3 days. It's a lot in 3 days. Like you're going to be getting so much information. It's so much fun. And I understand that if you can't attend all 3 days, that's why every day is going to be recorded. And so included in your weekend pass is the ability to watch the recordings for 3 whole months afterwards. So if you have to step away, you have other obligations, totally get it. Don't stress about it. You'll still be able to catch up and watch the presentations and workshops that you want. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.